that event is due to the increased greenhouse gases. A careful calculation. 20,000 people at least, some people say 35,000 people, died prematurely because of that heat wave. Temperature went over 40 Celsius in many European cities for extended periods of time, and lots of people died. So when I and others started talking about climate change being a weapon of mass destruction, we weren't so crazy as some people thought we were. And that would be an average summer by 2050, and by 2100 that will be a cool summer in Europe. So Europe's going to change a great deal in the summer in its average temperature. Sea level rise. You heat the oceans, the water expands, sea level rises. That's about 50 centimetres a century. Half a metre a century is the rate of increase in sea level. And it will go on for many centuries anyway, because the ocean takes time to warm up. It's only the top bit that's warmed up so far. So we're in for about half a metre a century. But then glaciers are melting too, and some ice from the ice caps is melting as well. And we're not quite sure quite how much, but we're pretty certain it's more than we thought it was. And so the best estimate we have for the rise in sea level this century is about a metre. A bit less perhaps, or maybe a bit more. There's the contours for Bangladesh. The 1, 2, 3, 5 metre contours. 10 million people live below the 1 metre contour. Where are those people going to go? 25 million people in southern China. The Maldives would largely disappear. All those islands in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And so on. I can go around the world. 50% of the world's population lives pretty close to the sea. So lots of people are going to be very seriously affected by sea level rise. We're going to, in Europe, we're going to have big problems too. There's a refugee family from Bangladesh escaping from floods that are caused by the rivers flooding because they have this low-lying ground, terribly fertile ground. They can grow very good crops, providing it doesn't flood. What about water in this globally warmed world? There's the Nile flowing through the Sudan. The red region is irrigated, it's an irrigated area. Marvellous to see the desert being irrigated, but that's shared water in that river. Lots of nations share it. It's going to get less in the future, almost undoubtedly. It's going to get drier. How is that sharing going to be done? In this globally warmed world, of course, we get more evaporation from the oceans, more water vapour in the atmosphere, more average rainfall, and we're seeing that at the moment. But as you will know from your physics, when water vapour condenses to form clouds, latent heat is released. And that latent heat is the largest source of energies for the atmosphere's circulation. So you get a more intense atmospheric circulation. That means the rain tends to come down in bigger dollops, more intense rainstorms, more floods on average. And the world is seeing more floods on average. We've had some very bad ones in the UK this last week. And it also means that as the air goes up, it has more energy, it can go higher, it can get drier, so some of the dry regions get drier, and we're going to get more droughts. The average rainfall is going to change, plus 30%, minus 30%, and the blue regions are more rainfall, the red regions are less rainfall, so the Mediterranean is going to tend to get very dry towards the end of the century. And those are very big changes in the average rainfall. So water availability is going to be a big problem. Water availability because of glaciers melting too, and glaciers store water in the Himalayas, for instance, for all those rivers in Asia. So water is going to be a very big problem. And floods and droughts are the most damaging of the world's disasters we know. They cause more misery, more economic loss, more deaths than any other disasters. So more of them, and more intense ones, is very bad news, especially for people in vulnerable areas. That's drought in Africa. The most frightening statistic I know in the climate world, is that of drought. Some work at the Hadley Centre, some modelling work, careful modelling work, suggests that if you take the usable land area of the world, at any one time, at the moment, something like 2% of that land area is in extreme drought. And drought is extreme or severe or moderate in its scientific definition. Extreme drought, 2%. 20 years ago, it was 1%. By 2050, it's likely to be 10 or 12%. If you can imagine that in vulnerable places like Africa and parts of Asia, South America and so on, imagine the devastation that will cause. Because droughts, instead of lasting a season, when people can cope with it, because aid goes in and you get seed given you for the next season and all that sort of thing, if it's going to last for years instead of a season, where are those people going to go? So that summarises my very quick review of impacts. I've mentioned all those top ones pretty well, but look at the bottom ones, you see. We're going to get hundreds of millions in the world of displaced people, genuine and environmental refugees. And where are those people going to go in our increasingly crowded world? We're going to have 1 or 2 more billion people anyway by then. And we're going to have hundreds of millions who can't live where they are. That's going to be a big problem. We're going to have ecosystems are going to be suffering very badly too, and we're losing millions of species because they can't cope with the rate of climate change. And it would be awful to be a member of a generation of humans on Earth who are responsible for losing millions of species. What are we doing? So what can we do about it? Very quickly on what's been done or what's been thought about. Well, it goes back to 1992. There was the big Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. All the world's nations got together and signed the Climate Convention, signed by all countries. President Bush signed for the United States, the first President Bush, that is. And it was unanimously agreed by ratified by the Senate very soon afterwards. And because they'd had the first IPCC report, they were able to make a statement that said, well, we don't understand all the science. There is still a lot of uncertainty, but we believe the messages are strong enough that we all have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And all developed countries should bring their 2000 emissions down to 1990 levels. And we've also got to stabilise, in due course, we've got to stabilise the climate by stabilising the carbon dioxide concentration, which means very rapid and massive reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions too. And that's 18 years ago now, 17 or 18 years ago now. And we've been talking about it ever since. What sort of level have we got to stabilise at? I show you that book because it's a good read. It won the Royal Society Prize for the best popular science book of the year in 2008. So it's accurate. It tells stories of people in different parts of the world and how they will be affected at different levels of temperature. I thought I knew a lot about this, but it's a pretty frightening book, especially when you get to 4, 5 and 6 degrees. Really frightening for the world. Devastating. The world's trying to aim at 2 degrees. How are we going to do that? And that was proposed by the EU Council in 1996, and people have been talking about it ever since. I'm not going to describe this in any detail, but just to remind you of the action we've got to take. We've got to become much more efficient in our energy. We've got to get electricity from carbon-free sources. We've got to change the way we do our agriculture, and we've got to move to electric vehicles. Lots of things, lots of exciting things to do, actually, and to do differently. And we also have to halt deforestation, because deforestation in the world is 20% of the emissions. As much comes from deforestation as comes from transport. So if Copenhagen does anything, it's got to find a solution to stopping tropical deforestation. And we've also got to learn to put carbon dioxide in the ground, carbon capture and storage. We've got to learn to use renewable energies on a big scale. That's a big PV plant in the United States. That's concentrated solar power. Solar power is going to be a wonderful source of power right around the world, and people are working on it, either using it thermally or using it from a photovoltaic source of point of view, and that's very important. We're going to all be driving electric cars, hopefully in 5 or 10 years. And That's the deforestation problem. Amazon